What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over another fun mechanic in our fighting game tutorial series, and that mechanic is counter hit. So counter hit is the process of one character performing an attack. They're still in their startup, they have not reached their active frames of that attack yet. They get hit by an enemy's attack, and so they get cancelled and go to their hit reaction. Additionally to this, a lot of times the character will receive extra damage or extra stun frames, or both. And so we're going to show how to implement all of that today. So typically, I will go up to my opponent and I can use an attack and they go into their stun state. Before this point in the series, we could both attack each other and one would hit first, the other would continue and hit as well. It's actually very simple to make it to where we have this counter property here. So we have one character hitting the other, and then the other character going to the hit reaction. So we're going to attack at the same time, one slightly after the other. You can see that the second character, the character on the right that is trying to perform the light attack, immediately gets cancelled and goes to the hit reaction. This also opens the character that was hit up to more combos, so the attacker has more combo potential from that. And we can do it the other way. So if I attack first with this character and attack late with the character on the left, then you can see that the character on the left is being punished, and that is the counter hit property. You couldn't really see the extra damage or the additional stun frames here, but I will be going over that and showing you that a little bit more depth as we get through the episode. A large portion of today's episode is going to be live coded because I do want to show you these changes as I make them, as they can be pretty complicated if you're just looking at the results. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for all the love and support. I am really so grateful. Just really appreciate it, and I want to give you a huge shout out because you guys deserve it. Thank you so much. Now, before we get started on this episode, if you'd like to get caught up on the series, we are on episode 160 of the fighting game tutorial series, so we have come really far from the beginning. We still have a really long way to go as well, but we are getting there. I'll link this playlist right here in the top right corner. Alternatively, if you just care about the counter hit, I would recommend that you watch the initial episode where we set up our hit reactions, because we're going to need to do some stuff to cancel out of our attack and go to the hit reaction. That episode will be in the top right corner right here. With all that said, we can go ahead and get started. So, the first thing we want to do is go to our fighter template character code class, and we're going to want to go to the CPP. We're going to scroll down to our take damage function, which for me is right here. Now, pretty much everything I do in this function is going to be live today. There is something small that I've added in here that was not previously in here, but I didn't want to go too far because if I'm moving all this stuff around, it's going to be really confusing to compare yours to what we have after this episode. So in take damage, to perform a counter hit, we have to know that the character receiving damage is in the attack started or attack startup state, whatever you're calling that. So the attack state is something that I made in my fighter template character. And it had values for started, active, and recovery, or startup, active, and recovery, grab started, and grab break as well. In this episode, we specifically care if we're taking damage during the attack startup and attack started enum value here. If we are, we want to be able to cancel out of our attack and go straight to the hit reaction. The logic for this is insanely simple. We actually just want to check if the attack state is equal to our startup attack state or our started attack state. Remember that this is in take damage, so the character taking damage is the one that is at risk to be canceled out of their attack to go into their hit reaction. So we can use the attack state of that character and just compare it to the enum value, and if it is in the attack started state, we want to increase the damage they're going to take, increase the number of stun frames that they're going to have, and then go about the rest of our logic. What I do is I make a local variable, I call it increased damage, which is a float because our damage amount is a float, and I take the damage amount passed into this function and multiply it by an arbitrary value. We can enhance this by changing this arbitrary value to a variable, something like counter hit damage multiplier, and multiplying it by that instead of the 1.25. Regardless though, the increased damage is being set equal to the damage amount times this multiplier, which is giving a higher damage value. So if this is a counter hit, which it is because we're in this if statement, we're going to use this increased damage when we take away from the player's current health. The stun frames is essentially the same process. I just have the stun frames as an integer because it's a number of frames, not a float, and the hit stun frames is also an integer, so we want to make sure we keep our types the same. Even though it's an integer, I can multiply by a float because a float and an integer multiplied together will return an integer that is truncated. So it will actually do the multiplication, but if there's a decimal, it'll drop the decimal and just be a whole number. So I can still multiply it by this value, 1.25, and we'll still get a different value than what we had initially. It's just that it won't keep the remainder from the decimal. So these are our increased values. Now additionally, I have 2 UE logs. And if you've been following the series, you'll see how I've used UE logs in the past. But if you're not, basically, we can call a macro UE log, which is something that Unreal has, and we can pass it to log temp so we can see it in the output log when we're playing the game, as a warning, which is yellow text. Just basically determines the severity, and warning is yellow. You can also put an error, which would be red, or just a regular log, which would be white. I like making it a different color so it's easier to see. Warning typically works. And then here is my text macro, so this is what's actually going to print. Notice that I have the character is taking increased damage for %F points due to counter hit. %F is a way we can actually inject a variable into here. So %F, if we pass a parameter after the text macro, see, text, comma, and then a variable, we can get this variable's result in here as long as these types match. Damage, increased damage is a float, so we want %F because F for float. So 4, and then it'll put this value in here, points. Now the stun frames is essentially the same. The character is being stunned for %D extra frames due to counter hit, and we're passing in increased stun frames. D is actually for decimal here. At this point, I also want to change this log actually because this is saying that the character is being stunned for %D extra frames, but this would be the entire frames, the entire number of frames of stun, not just the extra frames. So we should change this to something like character is being stunned for this number of frames due to counter hit. And then we could do normally, and then pass it %D again, frames. Something like that. And now, what we can do is pass another parameter here, so we have our increased value, and then we can pass it the normal hit stun frames, the normal amount of frames, and so we'll be able to see the difference. And in fact, I think I'm going to do that with the damage while we're here, just because it makes the log a little bit easier to actually see. So let's do normally %F points. This is just points of damage, so that works. And we'll make sure that we also pass it the regular damage amount. Just like that. Now I am going to save this. I'm going to close this, relaunch, and I'll meet up with you when it is open again. Now the editor is back open, so we can play the game, go into the verses, select our stage, skip our entrances, and when we come in here and go to the output log, I can pull the window up here, and I can attack my opponent. Nothing will print because I've disabled all logs that aren't for the counter hit, so we're looking good there. Now let's perform a counter hit. And you can see that it says The character is taking increased damage for 0.125 points due to the counter hit, normally 0.1 points. And that is correct. I did forget a parenthesis. Make sure you don't forget that like me. But it doesn't really matter as it is just for debugging. The character is being stunned for 56 frames due to counter hit, normally 45 frames. And these values are the correct values as well. We can verify this because we have our mutant hitbox data table. And the light attack is the attack I'm using, and it's got a hitbox damage of 0.1, which the log had told us that it was normally 0.1, but now it's 0.125 due to the counter hit. The normal hit stun frames on this move is 45, a very high value, and the character is being stunned for 56 frames due to the counter hit, normally 45. So we can tell our values are correct and they are increasing. We just have to make them actually do that, not just print it, but actually do it in the take damage function. We'll get to that in a second though. The next thing we want to do, now that we know our values are working and our states are working as intended, is to go into our anim BP for our characters. And any states that we can transition out of. So any of our attacks that won't have super armor or won't be invincible on startup, that can go to the hit reaction, that can be counter hit, we need to have a transition rule from that attack to the hit reaction state. Now the hit reaction I've covered in many other episodes, so I'm not going to go over it today. But you can take a look at that if you want to look at how my hit reaction is working. I basically just have different hit reactions for the height of the hitbox or for the type of the hitbox. Then I had a transition rule from idle to hit reaction that could go from any of these combo states. So if we're in any of these, we can go to the hit reaction state, and the hit reaction state figures out which animation to play. Now I know this graph is really ugly. I mentioned this in the previous episode, but I am currently working on a code state machine so that we don't have to look at all this ugliness. It is optional, as you are able to keep working in your BP state machine. It just gets very convoluted because I don't even have all my connections in here. And it is hard to show you exactly what I'm trying to show you. So that code one is coming in the near future, and it is a lot cleaner. So just hang in a little bit longer if you're struggling with all these lines. But the important part here is that our light attack, or really all of our attacks that we can cancel out of to the hit reaction because of a counter hit, they should have a transition rule from them to the hit reaction. Now luckily, this idle to hit reaction I have as a shared rule. It's okay if you don't. You can click on any transition rule in the anim BP and promote it to shared. Once you do this, it will ask you to give it a name. For my idle to hit reaction, I called it enter hit reaction. So now I can click on any other transition rule, such as light attack to hit reaction, and I can go and call it enter hit reaction. I can just select this drop down and select the one I want. So it's very easy to go from one attack to the hit reaction after we have the idle to hit reaction set up. It's actually super simple. Additionally, I have set the blend time duration to 0.0. This is optional, as it is up to you. However, my animations are really long, so 0.2 seconds is a really long blend. And it can look a little funny if I go from start to hit reaction on this blend. My animations weren't really lining up the way I wanted them to. Additionally, the blend time here, if this is too long, you could lead into your active state, which could still spawn the hitbox. You could get some weird behavior from it. So unless you have really trimmed down animations, custom animations, a couple frames for your attacks, I would recommend that you have no blend time on here. But again, it is up to you. You can play around with it and see what you like the best. As long as it all works, it's perfectly fine. It is entirely up to you. I only have it on my light attack now, but it does work on any other attack, so feel free to add more now if you'd like. Additionally, when going from any of the attack states to the hit reaction, we do want to make sure that we reset all of our logic for the attack and clean up all the hitboxes. So our start transition event should include our end attack transition, which is the same event that we use when returning from any of the commands and any of the attacks. The hit reaction will still do all of its specific state logic, so we aren't overriding that with this event. We're just resetting it back to the default state before going into the hit reaction. This way, the hit reaction can process just like it normally does, and then return us to the idle state afterward. On top of that, be aware that if the character is defeated from the hit, instead of going from the attack to the knockdown or defeated state, it will go into the stun first, the hit reaction first, and then back to idle, and then to this state. You can feel free to add a transition rule from the attack directly to the defeated state to fix this issue, but this will come more when we're going over the code state machine that I mentioned earlier in the episode. I'll go over all those specific states. That way you can see a lot more of the transitions instead of being cluttered with all these other lines and transition rules. So the code state machine will solve that issue and will cover all those instances. But if you want to go ahead and get a head start, make sure you can go from your attack to your round lost state, and that issue will not occur. At this point, let's go back to our take damage function and do some live code, because this time we are going to make sure that we move everything from our take damage function into the appropriate spot. So I'm actually going to stop Unreal, and we're going to edit this code. So this is the counter hit. In fact, I'll even label this counter hit, because that's what this means. That's what this if statement essentially is saying. These logs are great, and they helped us determine that everything was working as intended, but they're not exactly doing what we need. We're not really using that increased damage to take away from the player's health, and we're not increasing the number of frames they actually receive. We're just printing out the value that we calculated. So what we can do is kind of merge our logic together here where it works for both methods. So I'm going to add an else here. So this is the counter hit. This if statement's the counter hit. The else is everything else if it's not a counter hit. But we don't want to just do all the logic we've already been doing, because then we'll end up in the same spot that we're already in. Again, what we need to do is figure out what logic is unique and what logic is shared. So this overall if statement, I didn't mention it earlier, but this is just saying that we have not blocked. Okay, no successful block was given. If you put your cursor on the bracket, you can scroll down, follow the line, and see that this bracket is the end of that if statement. This else is for blocking, taking damage while blocking. All of this down to the rest of the function, to the end of the function, is not going to be relevant for today's episode. We can't be blocking and enter the counter hit state, because if we're blocking, we're not going to be in our attack startup state. We're only worried about the code within this if statement. Or essentially to line 1372. So let's go down this one at a time. And what I'm going to do is I am going to keep these logs here. And I'm going to uncomment out this log so that it's usable again. And I am going to separate the player health lines with that log. And I'm going to remove this old one. So if it's the counter hit, we're taking the increased damage, but if it's not, we're taking the regular damage. Because of this, I want to make sure that I am decreasing player health on the counter hit by the increased damage. Perfect. Now the super meter amount is up to you if you want to make that unique or not. My super meter amount currently is calculated by the damage amount multiplied by an arbitrary value. So if you want, you could also put this inside of your counter hit property like that. But instead of using damage amount, use increased damage. Again, this is up to you. You don't have to do it that way. Now, the last damage received is used to track frame data, so in practice mode and training. We do want to calculate the actual damage received, and so if that changes, we will want to use the increased damage. So instead of using damage amount here, we use increased damage. Perfect. Now at this point, most of this stuff is going to be shared. There's still another thing that we have to adjust, but all of this logic is shared. We're basically just doing a small clamp for our super meter amount. That's fine. We're making sure that if our player health is less than the minimum value, we were defeated from that hit. That's fine. We're determining if we should go into the regular knockdown or the hard knockdown state. That can be shared. Playing the visual effects and the sound effects, perfectly fine to be shared. Now the number of stun frames being equal to the hit stun frames. Let's pull that out. In the else, we do want to put that in here because we do want the number of hit stun frames to be correct based on which state we're in. If we're in the counter hit if statement here, we don't want to use hit stun frames. We want to use our increased stun frames. But if we're in the else, we can just use the regular hit stun frames. Last stun frames received is actually fine if you want to keep it here, because notice that it's being set to num stun frames. Num stun frames is what we're setting in each case here. So regardless if we set to hit stun frames or increased stun frames, num stun frames is the one we're using for the last stun frames received, and thus we can keep it as a shared thing. We don't have to put it in both the if and the else. Now we have the logic where we check to see if the num stun frames is greater than 0, and if it is, we go into the appropriate stun state. This is shared. We do want to do this. So we don't want to move that into the if or the else. The begin stun, the begin hit stop is also shared. Now the last section here is what we do to the other player, or essentially the attacker, when damage has been dealt. Yes, they've still landed the hit, so that's shared. Yes, pushback should be occurred, so that is shared. The super meter amount technically could be different, because if you want them to build their super meter amount based off the damage they dealt, you could go ahead and change it. So this is, again, up to you. If you'd like, it's very simple. We can copy this line right here. So other player super meter amount plus equals damage amount times that modifier. In the counter hit, instead of using damage amount, we can use increased damage. If you'd like, go ahead and check for other player here. I know it is an additional if check, but it doesn't hurt when we are risking crashing otherwise if that object is invalid. And if you do that, then you don't need to have this logic in here anymore. Otherwise, you will do it twice. We don't want that. And then this is a small clamp for the super meter amount, which is shared, and performing pushback on the damaged character, which is also shared. So at this point, this is what our if statement and else statement look like. And we are good to go. If we are to test this, we should see that our damage and our stun frames have changed, and we will work as intended based on the counter hit property. I'm going to go ahead and launch the game, and I'll catch up when the engine is open. Editor is back open, so we can launch. We can come into the game. I'm going to go to the output log here. Skip some of this stuff. And when we get here now, you should see that if I do a regular hit, the character is taking damage for 0.1 points, right? If I do a counter hit, the character is now taking the increased damage due to the counter hit, and they're being stunned for longer. Now, you can go as far as to test and make sure that the damage and the stun frames are working correctly. You have a few methods. The one method I'm going to choose is just go to my character in the world, search the details for player health, and here's my player health value of 0.775. Now remember that the full amount is 1.0. So they took 0.1 and then 0.125, which would get you to 0.775. Again, looking at it now, I'm going to do a standard hit, which would bring it to 0.675. And now I'm going to do a counter hit, which should bring it to 0.55. And there you go. You can see that the damage is working as intended. We do want to test it for the other character just to be absolutely sure. And so we can see that their health is 1.0. If they take a standard hit, they go to 0.9. And if they take a counter hit, they go to 0.775. So that's working as intended. Let's make sure our stun frames are as well. So we have our frame data, which is the last stun frames received, and we also have our current stun frames. You can take a look at either. When I hit the opponent regularly, whoops, that's the wrong character. If I hit my opponent regularly, you should see that they had 45 stun frames received, but if they counter hit, they have 56 stun frames received. And just to be extra thorough, let's check the other character. Let's do a regular hit, and you'll see that they have 45 stun frames received, but if they do a counter hit, they now have 56 stun frames received. Notice trading hits is a lot more difficult now, as you actually can be canceled out. So unless the attacks occur on the same frame or one frame apart, you will be canceled out, but it is still possible to trade hits. We can add some more leniency to that in the future as we go over some more elements of the combat flow, so don't worry too much if that is too strict for you. But it is a good thing now that both characters aren't always hit if one character hits the other very early in the character's startup or attack begin. So you can now see that counter hit is in and working, and additionally, on top of that, it actually modifies the damage and stun frames that are received by the character taking damage. Anyway, guys, that's all I got for you today. So I hope you enjoyed, and I hope this helped you make your counter hit property in your fighting game. If it did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon members and YouTube membership subscribers again. Thank you guys for all the love and support and for everything you've done. I am really grateful, and I'm really enjoying working on this game with you. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I would be happy to assist you, and it's completely free. Like I said, guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.